my friends. Welcome to another episode of Can You Talk Real Quick? Stand Up with Pete Dominic production, which is just a shorter podcast where I just have a one-on-one conversation without all the production, obviously the news segment and the rest. Today I called up my good friend Glenn Kirschner, 30-year former federal prosecutor. Of course, you know him from MSNBC, his hit YouTube channel Justice Matters, and more, to talk about the remaining trials. Well, all of them are remaining, but the schedule for Trump's trials coming up in 2024 and how we are in kind of a dead zone at the moment. Glenn has a great piece at MSNBC titled, "A Trial Delay Wouldn't Be the Win Trump Thinks It Is." Though the schedule of the former president's trial is still up in the air, we know enough to expect the cases won't overlap. Glenn explains it in that MSNBC piece and here on Stand Up With Me. If you like this, go subscribe to Glenn on YouTube as well as his podcast and on all of the social media platforms. And, of course, subscribe to this podcast with a paid subscription because I can't do these interviews without your support. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. And join the Justice Matters community, which I'm a very proud member of and love being a part of their community over there, who I've joined in person and online. So let's get to it. I caught up with Glenn on Monday in late November before we get all of this underway, and we had a great conversation about Trump's trials and, of course, so much more. Let's do it right now. The Kirschner Report with Glenn Kirschner. There he is, Glenn Kirschner. Hi, how are you? Happy middle between Thanksgiving and Christmas time.
Yeah, I guess happy holiday season, right?
Well, it's not, I feel like it's not trial season right now so much in terms of many of the trials that you're covering and helping us understand regarding the former disgraced president. What's happening right now?
Yeah, we are treading trial water right now. I can't wait for these trials to get underway. I have maintained all along that the March 4th trial in Washington, D.C. is the most likely trial the most likely trial date to actually stick. And I just did a piece for MSNBC that published minutes ago, trying to make sense of the crazy trial schedule, because it's like, you know, there's this game of musical chairs going on and nobody knows when the music's going to stop. And Trump is going to have to sit his big fat butt down in the defendant's chair. And one of these trials, you know, will commence against him.
Yeah, you lay them out here. You lay the schedule out here in this piece that I'll share here if people aren't following Glenn, which obviously I'm sure you are. Trump's current trial schedule is as follows. January 16th, E. Jean Carroll's second defamation trial against Trump begins. Just a word or two about these. So that really is happening. There's another trial. I mean, that's such a bizarre thing that he lost, did the thing again, and then they're going back to trial.
No one can ever accuse Donald Trump of learning from his mistakes, Pete. So this trial is only on damages because he's already been found to have defamed her a second time, precisely the way he did the first time. And he did it after the jury found he was liable for defaming her the first time. I mean, this guy is a colossal bozo. So listen, the jury awarded $5 million last time. If I have to place my $1 bet, that's my betting limit, I would probably put it on somewhere around 10 million this time. Now, maybe that's still chump change for Donald Trump, but the way his New York fraud trial has been going, I don't know how much money Donald Trump actually has. I don't think Donald Trump knows how much money he actually has, but one way or another, he's about to have a whole lot less.
All right, so that's going to happen, and it's just a matter, again, not unlike the New York trial, he's already been found to be guilty of the crime. Now they're just looking at what the damages are going to be. And the trial that we've been watching him sometimes show up, because as you've explained, you don't have to be at the civil courts, but you do have to show up every day for these criminal cases. But just staying in New York there, that's just a decision that we're waiting to be made on how much of a fine he's going to have to pay and what, if any, punishment there will be on him doing business in the state of New York, where he has done so much business.
Yeah, exactly. He's already lost on the liability front. Judge Engoron ruled that he and Eric and Don Jr. Are in fact liable for having engaged in massive, years-long, systemic business fraud. And now it's all about the disgorgement, fancy word for how much of his ill-gotten gains will he have to disgorge? Will he have to pay back? And will he be prohibited from doing business in New York moving forward? I can't imagine he won't be, especially when you listen to the testimony of Trump and Don Jr. and Eric and Ivanka. Basically, when they were not feigning a failure to recall, they were saying, we don't know anything about the business we were doing in New York. So, I mean, the whole thing really is theater of the absurd. And I think Judge Engoron has got Trump's number.
I don't know how much you know about this. Maybe this is like a David K. Johnson, Tim O'Brien question. But I mean, if he's not able to do business in New York, which is possible, I mean, how much of that's where he and his sons, that's where a lot of the people they know are, and they know people all over the world, I'm sure, but so much, I don't know what percentage of their business, the revenue came from real estate or branding in New York, but that seems like that would be a very damaging thing, if not to their finances, certainly to their egos, not being able to paste their name anywhere. Not that anybody would want it at this point.
Yeah, and whether in New York or in other states, do you really think any reputable financial institutions are going to want to do business with these characters? I mean, maybe he'll still have money flowing in from Russia, who the heck knows? But I do think his time as a businessman is pretty much done, I think, in New York and elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's crazy to kind of imagine after seeing him, grown up in New York and seeing so much of their business be there. But that's just the consequence of that one trial, which is not even part of your list here. His federal trial it begins in March. Two of his criminal trials commence in March. His federal trial for the 2020 election interference. That's Jack Smith with Judge Chutkan in D.C. That's in Washington on March 4th. And the New York State trial for falsifying business records, that is the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels. I didn't realize that was still going on until I read this piece. And I'm not even halfway through this schedule. What do you want to say about, you said that date is the least likely to move, the March 4th date with Judge Chutkan. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like we have to take a commercial break midway through discussing Donald Trump's many trials.
I know.
But I say, in case you wanted to sell something, I don't know. No, but here's the thing, Pete. March 4 is about as firm a trial date as exists presently. I was in the courtroom when Judge Chutkan said, and I quote, "This trial will not yield to the election cycle, and we will not revisit the March 4 trial date." Now, Donald Trump's lawyers are going to throw everything into the mix they can to try to bubble up an issue to the Supreme Court in that case that might result in the Supreme Court putting a stay or a pause on the trial date. I don't think he'll be successful. I don't think there is a viable legal issue that would result in the March trial date being paused by the Supreme Court, but stranger things have happened. But here's the one thing I can predict. The March, I think, 24, whatever the New York criminal trial on the falsifying business records.
25 you have here, yeah.
25, March 25. And think about it. This is no ordinary falsification of business records. He was falsifying New York business records because he wanted to cover up hush money payments. In essence, he was trying to gain unfair advantage in the 2016 election. So that's really what is at the core.
I don't understand much, but I do understand that that's the case where his lawyer, Michael Cohen, already went to jail, like was found guilty for that crime, and he was called co-conspirator number 1 or whatever.
That is a crime that Michael Cohen committed at the request of and for the benefit of Donald Trump. Cohen goes to jail. Donald Trump plays golf. Don't try to make sense of that one, because you can't.
Yeah.
But maybe justice is coming because he is criminally indicted in this pending trial. Here's the thing. That New York March trial date is basically already been continued, but not yet officially. Here's why I say that. When I was in court again for one of the status hearings in D.C., and Judge Chutkan was setting the March 4 trial date in D.C., she said, "I've spoken with Judge Juan Merchan, that is the judge presiding over Donald Trump's New York prosecution, and I let him know I was going to be setting this March 4 trial date." Now, she said nothing about the substance of her conversation with Judge Merchan, but the signal was clear. Basically, the judges got together and decided that his federal prosecution in Washington, D.C., for trying to overturn a presidential election would take precedence over his New York prosecution for falsifying business records scheduled for later in the month of March. So that one, I think very soon, the parties will appear in a status hearing up in New York, and Judge Marchand will probably set that trial date well down the road.
So then we go 2 months later, the other federal criminal trial regarding mishandling of classified documents, where, of course, he had top secret documents in his toilet and his aides running them all over the place. And we've seen it all. It's a total mess. And FBI subpoenaed him for them. And he said he gave them back, but he didn't give them back, and so on and so forth. Everybody knows that. But his friend, Judge Cannon, is somehow got the luck of the draw in charge of that. So there's a lot of controversy around the scheduling and the handling of that. But that's supposed to begin in Florida then. 2 months later,
20.
You're saying?
May
20th. And then finally, Fulton County, Georgia, the Georgia election interference with District Attorney Fani Willis requested August 5th as the proposed trial date. But what's fascinating, what's really important is what you're saying in this piece is Judge Cannon, they might convince Judge Aileen Cannon to kick the can down the road till after the election for the classified documents trial. But that's not going to help him, because it means Fani Willis can slide in and start her trial there. Forgive my choice of words. She can start her trial instead at that time. Is that what you're writing and saying and predicting?
Yeah, like I say, a lot of moving pieces here. But look, Judge Cannon all along has shown a willingness to move deadlines. She just reset nearly a dozen deadlines, filing deadlines and hearing deadlines that were in place that were supposed to put the May trial date in a position to be ready to go. But then she continued a dozen of those deadlines. So the signal has been sent. She's going to be willing to push the May 20 deadline. But, that may be Donald Trump winning a battle but losing the war, because Fani Willis said, OK, I'll start my RICO trial against him on August 5th. Think about this. If he was in the Florida documents trial, and I'm loath to call it the documents trial, Pete, because it's the Classified Documents, Obstruction of Justice, Espionage Act trial. Let's not lose sight of the fact he's indicted for violating the nation's Espionage Act by mishandling national defense information. So if that trial had started in late May, that would have made an early August trial date virtually impossible. But if she really wants to go ahead and continue that May trial date, guess what? He ought to be ready to go to trial in Georgia State in his RICO case beginning on August 5th.
There you go. Well, that'll be very interesting to see what happens there. I got to ask you about just the timing of all of these and how they could coincide, overlap, or conclude, most importantly. What, if any, will the federal case on election interference in D.C. with Judge Chutkan, prosecuted by Special Prosecutor Jack Smith, will that case arguments conclude before the summer?
That is probably a 4 to 6 week trial. I think those are the estimates that have been
starting in early March, so it could go to early May.
Yep. Jury selection starts on March 4th. Now, actually, the jurors are coming in on February 9th to fill out the jury questionnaire. So they are in the chute and ready to go on March 4th. Okay. Jury selection will take a couple of weeks. The trial will probably take 4, 5, 6 weeks. Donald Trump will be a convicted felon, probably by late April, early May. Now, for the rule of law purists out there, let me say, yes, technically, a conviction is not final until the day of sentencing. So technically, that's when he will be a convicted felon. But a jury will be voting guilty on that. I'll bet $1.25, probably late April, early May. And I think that changes not only the legal landscape, but the political complexion of the upcoming election. I can't believe that the Republican Party is going to continue to be so stupid. Well, maybe I do believe it, but at some point you have to make a different decision about the viability of the candidate you nominate from your party. At some point, like if he is ordered in prison serving a life sentence. Now, you really think the Republican Party at that point will not think better of who the nominee should be?
Do you think that he could be sentenced before the election? If he were.
So rule of thumb, from the date a jury votes guilty until the date somebody goes to sentencing, it's usually about 60 to 90 days, because there is a process that takes place where there's a background investigation of the defendant, of the offenses, and they talk to the victims in the case. And the pre-sentence report author puts together this really hefty piece of work that then gets provided to the judge to guide the judge's sentencing decision. All of that takes about 60 to 90 days. So, we're going to have Donald Trump sentenced sometime this coming fall. Wow.
That's quite a prediction. I hope you're right about that. Just going back to what we're seeing happen, you did this video where you read the holiday messages of the current president and Donald Trump. It was dark and horrible. But to hear you read them, the difference was just such a obvious disparity. One being a cartoon villain and one not. So I thought it was interesting to hear him again threaten Judge Ungaron's clerk by name. And I don't understand. I thought he was prevented from doing that, and it's very hard to keep up. You do a great job trying to keep us up to date on both your podcast and obviously your daily YouTube videos. But wasn't he gagged specifically, like a partial gag where just leave this woman alone? Don't name this person. And then didn't we just learn that there's been tons of threats, even though his lawyer tried to argue that he wasn't threatening them? There's been hundreds of threats against this judge and clerk. Like, I don't understand, Glenn.
So there were two gag orders issued, Pete, one in D.C. and one in New York. The one in New York covered Judge Engoron's clerk. However, both of them have been temporarily paused or stayed while the appellate courts in D.C. and New York handle the question of the constitutionality of each of those respective gag orders. So the minute it gets paused, Donald Trump starts attacking Judge Engoron's clerk again. And when he did that, when he posted about her again, there were calls that came in threatening. These were credible threats, according to the Judicial Threat Assessment Unit in New York, responsible for assessing these threats. Credible threats. They typed them all out, and they filled 275 pages, single-spaced, typewritten. The threats that came in to Judge Engoron and his clerk, all of that was packaged up and delivered not only to the appellate court in New York, but to the appellate court in Washington, D.C. As well. And here's the thing. 1 week ago today, Pete, I was in that courtroom in Washington, D.C., and I watched the appellate court argument on the legality and constitutionality of the gag order. And even though Donald Trump's lawyers keep maintaining Donald Trump doesn't directly threaten anyone, Judge Millett, the senior judge on the three-judge panel in D.C., said, wait a minute, there is a clear pattern here. Donald Trump posts something and witness threats follow. So they have already moved past that BS argument by Donald Trump's lawyers. So I think we're going to see, for what it's worth, gag orders reimposed both in D.C. and in New York. And then the question is, what does Donald Trump do to either violate them or to try to get around them somehow?
Lastly, just want to ask your take. I know you did some videos and thinking about all of these cases that have been brought in different states to try to prevent Donald Trump from being even on the ballot because he's an insurrectionist. People looking at interpreting the Constitution, 14th Amendment, I think Section 3 is it. I've talked a lot about this with my friend Eric Siegel and other legal scholars, but we now have a decision from Colorado. I think it's being appealed. But what do you think that any of these states are going to actually prevent him from being on the ballot? I think politically that'd be terrible, by the way. I don't know. It doesn't really matter.
what I think. But
yeah, I think regardless of how these states rule, I think the issue is going to bubble its way up to the Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court will be the one to decide exactly what Section 3 of the 14th Amendment requires. Not what it means, but what it requires. What it means is that if somebody takes an oath to support the Constitution and thereafter engages in insurrection, that person is disqualified from holding public office federally or in the states. That's what it means. How do you get there? What is the vehicle? That's what's got everybody wrapped around the axle. Does it have to be an act of Congress? Does it have to be a civil finding by a judge, as we just got from Colorado Judge Sarah Wallace, a factual finding after a trial at which witnesses testified, and Judge Wallace found in that case Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. The evidence proved it. Does it have to be a criminal conviction for insurrection? So this is the issue that everybody's trying to contend with. I think the Supreme Court will take it up, and I think the Supreme Court will decide, for better or worse. I don't have a lot of faith in the Supreme Court these days, what exactly is required to disqualify that person from holding office in the future. But here's what we should all hold fast to, Pete. You know, that hard right block of the Supreme Court, those justices, you know, the ones who are happy to revoke our constitutional rights, like women's constitutionally protected privacy rights to make their own reproductive health decisions. There's one thing that motivates and animates them. They love being above the law.
Right.
They love being the Supreme Court, supreme to the chief executive, the president of the United States. In the back of their minds, they all know that if they do anything to enable or facilitate Donald Trump's return to the Oval Office, they will be putting an aspiring dictator back in presidential power. And if there's one thing an aspiring dictator has no interest in, it's a Supreme Court. They'll be cutting off their nose to spite their face. I don't trust their loyalty or allegiance to the Constitution or to constitutional interpretation, but I do trust that they are so self-motivated.
Their thirst to maintain power.
That they will not put Donald Trump back in office, and they will probably rule accordingly.
I think that's an interesting and probably accurate interpretation. They're not really that ideological. Their main ideology is to stay a Supreme Court justice and think about their reputation and be up there. I just had to ask you one more thing.
Pete, let me just add, they just put out a code of ethics, which is not a code of ethics. Yeah. It's a pamphlet of suggestions. Yeah. That's all it is.
Yeah, it sounds like the code of ethics.
Thing. It's laughable.
Sounds like the code of ethics at the Justice Matters YouTube channel. I mean, there isn't one. Okay, it's just Glenn. He does whatever the hell he wants. Look at he's wearing a hoodie, for God's sake. I mean, there is no code of ethics that you have.
There's no dress code. I'll go that far. There's no dress code.
I've been watching people say, I guess the news is that the new Speaker of the House is Mike Johnson, whatever his name is. He's going to reveal all the January 6th video or whatever. And I read some op-eds from some crazy person saying that we're going to soon, and I've heard other people say, soon we're going to find out now the truth about January 6th. Genuinely curious as to what narrative they're going to come up with, because I guess you could argue if you look at certain cameras, they were peaceful protesters. If you just looked at one feed, and if I edited together one feed and just see people walk around causing no harm, breaking no laws. You've covered this. You've been in the court for so many of these trials as well as anybody. What possibly could change the narrative? But what we already saw play out, as well as the investigation on television and so on, with more, quote, context, with more tapes. Do you see anything changing no matter how hard they try?
No, they're flooding the zone, and all they're doing is preaching to the converted cult. That's what they're doing. Yeah. And they're throwing the Trump supporters and the Trump base more of what they've been throwing at them, which is garbage for years now. And you know, I still struggle with how to approach the whole idea that an enormous swath of the American population is stuck in a cult. And here's the thing, Pete, ordinarily, when we have friends or acquaintances, neighbors, loved ones who have fallen prey to a cult, we try to help pull them out. We actually try to help break that crazy hold that a cult has over people. And I know it's easy to demonize the whole MAGA cult, but I mean, they're in a cult and they could use whatever help, we can provide to extract them from that cult. I think the best way to go about it is by, imprisoning the cult leader for the rest of his life, taking away his megaphone. And I really don't believe there's another figure that is going to sort of galvanize the support and the attention, the adoration of the MAGA cult the way Donald Trump has.
Right.
So, if we would just apply the rule of law as it was intended to be applied and detain Donald Trump pending trial, because that's what the law provides, we've just declined to do it so far, that would go a long way.
I do want to be clear one thing up that we've been heard. You heard Clay Higgins say this to Christopher Wray the other day with his crazy conspiracy. That guy is a maniac, Clay Higgins. But there's this conspiracy theory. There's this theory that there are undercover FBI agents on January 6th at the Capitol, at the rally, and so on, and that they were the ones who encouraged people to go in and so on. Now, here's the thing I think is important, because nobody's saying that there wasn't undercover agents. I hope there was. I mean, regardless of how you feel ethically about law enforcement working undercover, they always do at every level of law enforcement. The police department, the FBI obviously has undercover agents infiltrating all kinds of different drug gangs and mafia. Obviously, we've all seen those movies. A friend of mine's brother was a longtime ATF undercover agent, where he was in like motorcycle gangs undercover for a long time. I have no doubt there were undercover agents on that day in Washington. Maybe there were, maybe there weren't. But the difference, I think, is what we're talking about: entrapment, potentially. The idea that those undercover agents working anywhere are somehow helping the others plot and create a crime. What about the possibility of that on January 6th with the FBI?
It's nonsense. It is stone cold nonsense. It's really just feeds into the conspiracy theories that the cult wants to believe. And here's the thing. We could do a whole hour on what it means to have been an FBI source, which is different than an undercover agent. Once an FBI source, always an FBI source. The reason I say that is and I worked with the FBI and I worked with sources as a federal prosecutor. Once the FBI gets its hooks into a source, generally because the source has done some crime and they want to work it off, so they start to work in a covert capacity, providing information to the FBI, sometimes passively, sometimes actively, where they will infiltrate an organization or an enterprise and provide information. But it runs the gamut. But there may very well have been any number of any type of sources like that who were on the Capitol grounds that day. It would be, 0.0001% of the entire, Trump supporting world that was there attacking the Capitol. And the notion that any one person who said, yeah, let's get in there and take our country back, somehow influenced the 30,000 strong, Trump mob is just kind of absurd. And I also don't believe the FBI would have sent anybody in there to intentionally gin things up so law enforcement officers could be assaulted and potentially killed or lose their lives thereafter. The whole notion is absurd.
Thank you very much for clearing that up, in case anybody was still confused, but worth helping people understand how things work and why that would make zero sense and have no effect. It wouldn't. How would you possibly hypothetically have an effect? And they try to pin people, like actual names, and they go nowhere. And in fact, the people who did cause that and plan it, many have been arrested. You were at their trials, like Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, like the people we know who planned it. They've gone to jail.
Yeah. And they weren't part of the FBI or part of some covert FBI operation. The Oath Keepers have been taken down. The Proud Boys have been taken down. I think we've got more than 1,000 people convicted and hundreds more coming. So, that again, trying to debunk conspiracy theories is a full-time job, and it becomes kind of pointless.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much, as always, for your time. Very helpful understanding all of this.
Great talking to you, Pete.
Yes, thank you very much, Glenn Kirschner. Go follow him on the social media apps, all of them, and most importantly, go subscribe to his YouTube channel, support him on Patreon, and listen to his podcast as well, which I think he's dropping every week now. Join the Justice Matters community. Join the stand-up community at patreon.com/Pete Dominick. Right now, can't do these episodes without your support. Hope you appreciated it and learned as much from Glenn as I did. Helps me understand where we're at and where we're going. That's all I've got for you right now. On to the next smart guest to learn from. Thank you for your support. Talk to you later.
Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you gotta stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light.